And I'll give y'all, I guess, a little bit of an intro. My name is Ridge Howell, if we haven't had the chance to meet. And I am in the council position in IAC's Law and Policy Department, or Law and Government Affairs. I can't remember what our official department title is right now since the change, but I'm one of the attorneys for IAC. And we have been out doing outreach for DFAP, the Discrimination Financial Assistance Program, since the beginning of August. And as all of you know, we're today going to kind of give an overview, or I'm going to give an overview of how you can help a producer through an application. I plan to cover some basics about what the program is, some differences in the paper versus online applications, and tips and tricks for that. And we're also going to cover how we have kind of put together a program for filling out these applications with producers. And we can talk through some example scenarios of what that might look like. If at any point y'all have questions, which I'm sure there will be, if you want to just raise your hand, or there's not many of us, so y'all can stop me too. Just let me know and we can walk through the questions together, because that's really about the best way to learn about this process. And kind of what we found throughout our outreach is that really there are a lot of questions that we don't have answers to, but the best way we've been able to at least wrap our head around it is just by going through the application side by side with the producer, because each one's going to be a little bit different. Do you want to go ahead and switch to slide 2?
Is it on slide 2?
Mine still has the first one.
Okay.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, so what is DFAP? Really simply put, it's a one-time program that Congress authorized under the Inflation Reduction Act to provide financial assistance to ranchers, farmers, and forest landowners who are determined to have experienced discrimination in USDA lending programs prior to January 1st, 2021. Specifically, the IRA called for the program to make $2.2 billion available for discrimination financial assistance for anybody essentially who can show that they experienced discrimination in USDA FSA loan programs. Program, you'll hear me say that a lot throughout this. It's important because DFAP is a program and not a lawsuit. There are some similarities with, at least in the work we do, with the Keep Siegel case. But at the end of the day, that was a lawsuit that ended up having a settlement, and producers were paid out of that settlement. DFAP is a program that was created by Congress, and really kind of it's their way of acknowledging that there's been a long history of discrimination in USDA FSA loan programs. But instead of letting it get to a lawsuit point like we've had in the past with Keep Siegel and other discrimination cases, they were proactive in trying to put this program out for individuals to apply for discrimination financial assistance. The big difference is just where the money comes from. And the other key difference is because this is a program and not a lawsuit, those who applied for Keep Siegel, whether or not they were successful in their application, are eligible to apply for this program. Could you go to the next one? Thank you. And we'll talk a little bit more in depth about Keep Siegel in a couple of slides. Generally, who is eligible? It's any farmer or rancher or would-be farmer or rancher who experienced discrimination in USDA FSA's loan programs prior to January 1st, 2021. This is an important date because the discrimination had to happen prior to that, but there's no start date to the program. Excuse me. There's no start date to the program. So producers who, had an instance of discrimination that happened 30 or 40 years ago, technically could still be eligible to apply for this and receive a financial assistance payment. Continuing DFAP eligibility extends to keep Siegel claimants, like I said in the last slide. Whether or not you received an award, the applicant still might be eligible to participate based on the exact same claim. This reason is why that lawsuit versus program is a really key distinction. And I think something that we found throughout our outreach is that a lot of Keep Siegel claimants have, well, a lot of them don't have their paperwork, but those who do, there's a pretty easy correlation between the Keep Siegel information that had to be submitted and the discrimination information that is required under this application. So if you're working with a producer on an application who is a Keep Siegel recipient, if they have any of that paperwork and they can find it, it's really valuable because a lot of the questions can just about be directly copied and pasted into the question and answer portions of the DFAP application. Another point on eligibility, there's broad, there's no start date to the program, and the definition for discrimination is pretty broad, but the kind of exception to that is claims on behalf of the states are not eligible. What does that mean? In other words, if a farmer you're working with experienced discrimination from USDA, FSA on a loan in 2015, and then in 2020, that farmer passed away, the farmer's estate or the farmer's heirs may not file a claim on the farmer's behalf. So even if it was a totally valid claim while the farmer was living and looked like it might be successful under this, those heirs or whoever, inherited that farmer's land or livestock, they won't be eligible to apply for Keep Siegel. There's one exception to this. Farmers who assumed or were assigned a loan from another producer who was discriminated against in the process of applying for that loan or receiving that loan, you are eligible to apply on their behalf. This is a slim distinction. I don't know that in any of our outreach, we've come across a producer who had an assumed or an assigned loan from USDA or FSA. It's a possibility. And just in that scenario, that's the one time where somebody could file a claim on behalf of the estate. And that's really just because the discrimination, you could prove that it happened, and then you could also show that you are still paying on it or still were paying on it. So generally, claims on behalf of the states are not eligible. There's one exception for assumed or assigned debt where that original person was discriminated against. I am good to go to the next one. So what does a producer have to prove? The easiest way to think about this is there's no smoking gun required. There's an evidentiary standard for substantial evidence, and that means that somebody would be able to provide relevant evidence that a reasonable person could accept as adequate to support the conclusion that discrimination occurred. So what does that mean? It sounds like a bunch of legal jargon, and it is because the substantial evidence requirement. But essentially, it's a standard where you have to put yourself in the place of a reasonable person who is grading the application. So if somebody was reading through a producer's application and they were, essentially reading it reasonably, would they, or reading it like a common person would they think that there was a chance that discrimination occurred? So could somebody provide evidence that would make them think it's, there's a chance that it occurred. Key distinction on this is that this is a lower evidentiary standard than Keep Siegel applicants had to contend with. We'll talk about it a little bit further in the next slide, but basically this standard is, it's lowered for a couple of reasons. One, again, we have the program, not a lawsuit distinction. And two, because there's no beginning date to DFAP, the discrimination could have happened 50 or 60 years ago. Because there's not a beginning date, USDA has acknowledged that many producers who apply likely won't have any documents from the time the discrimination occurred. And because of that, they lowered it. I would say, just as kind of a point of practice that I've noticed in the past few months, very few, Keep Siegel or not, applicants have all of the information. Some applicants will have extensive documents, but the majority might have a few that could be helpful. But there's also a pretty big group of people that we've come across who don't have anything. We've heard, stories from fires burning somebody's house or somebody's file room. There's, a history of FSA not keeping good records, even in the 7-year period that they were required to keep them. But for all intents and purposes, it boils down to this is a lower standard than other programs or lawsuits that are similar to this. So if you come across a producer who had a bad experience with, let's say, Keep Siegel, I found it really helpful to emphasize that, even if they didn't get Keep Siegel, there's a good chance that they could get this because the evidentiary standard is a lot different. So what are some examples of that? Failure to provide appropriate assistance. Let me clarify. Examples that show somebody who, reading this as a reasonable person would think that discrimination was likely to have occurred. So in a scenario where there was a failure to provide appropriate assistance, an example of this would be somebody going into a FSA office for a yearly operating loan that they, have, if not every year, almost every year. And usually there was somebody who was there helping them reapply for it. The discrimination in this scenario could be that there was nobody who was helping that producer apply for that operating loan when they went in, and therefore didn't get the assistance they needed. Some more examples: a delay in processing loans or a loan servicing application, a denial of a loan or loan servicing, prevention from applying for a loan or loan servicing, adverse loan terms, unduly onerous supervision of loan requirements. It's basically anything that looks like, discrimination might have occurred. We'll get into, again, kind of what discrimination means for producers a little bit later on. But for right now, it's good to just think of it as somebody being treated differently than somebody else. So what's an example of that, a producer could show to say, I was discriminated against in this loan process? One more note, I think, from these bullet points is that this shows that it doesn't have to be, the discrimination didn't have to occur at the time somebody was applying for the loan. It could have, but it also could have occurred long after. If somebody had a long-term loan with FSA and at some point the loan servicing just really shifted, that could be an example of discrimination that would make somebody potentially eligible for this program. Any questions on that? Okay, I'm good for the next one. So again, some of this will be a little bit repetitive, but evidence and documents. A wide range of documentation may be submitted in support of a discrimination claim, including but not limited to a statement of a non-relative made under penalty of perjury with specific recollection of the applicant's experience. So in a scenario where somebody doesn't have documents, but they want to support their story, USDA and the national administrator who is over this program made it to where you could submit a statement under penalty of perjury. This is essentially an affidavit that you don't have to have notarized. And it's a way for somebody else to, validate what you're saying, explain what the discrimination was from their point of view. It's basically just a way to get evidence in front of USDA whenever, or in front of the national administrators who are grading the application, whenever you might not have documents to put with it. A key point for this is that it cannot be, the statement under penalty of perjury cannot be made by a relative. This is something we've pushed back on quite a bit because while we're out helping producers with applications, so often the only person they told was a relative. A lot of these scenarios wrongly end in shame for producers or embarrassment because of their denial or because of how they were treated. So one of the big things we've witnessed out on the road is that, like I said, a lot of times people just don't tell anybody else. Another kind of point on this is, we work in Indian country, and the idea of relatives or kinship in Indian country is a lot different than it is elsewhere. Because we brought that to USDA, they have specified that under this program, a relative is immediate family. So mother, father, brother, sister, son, daughter, extended family, even including aunts and uncles, cousins. For the purposes of a statement under penalty of perjury, that is a non-relative. So even if you didn't tell a neighbor or a banker, did you have a cousin who you spoke with at the time who could validate what you're saying? Another point on this, something that we're really trying to emphasize when we're working with producers, is that a lot of times, a certain county or a group of counties will have a lot of history of discrimination. So, there are some counties that we've been to where there are 15, 20, 30 families literally who have had some pretty blatant discrimination. One thing we're encouraging in those scenarios is that even if they did not tell others about it, if somebody has had the same issue within an office or within a specific employee in an FSA office, you could encourage them to write statements under penalty of perjury for each other. So an example of this would be, for instance, we've had a lot of issues out of Glacier County, Montana. And while not everybody, who had issues in Glacier County spoke about their denials or their, the cut that they received or the deduction they received from their yearly operating loan or whatever the issue was, there have been a lot of people with similar experiences. So in that scenario, we've encouraged them to write statements under penalty of perjury for each other, where, even if they didn't know about the scenario whenever it happened, around the same time, they knew what was happening out of that office. So they could say, even if we didn't, have one-on-one conversation with the producer who is discriminated against, we knew that in this time period, there were X amount of families who were dealing with discrimination from this person. Our family was one of them. This was our discrimination with that person. So it's, basically this is a tool that can be used creatively to try and get evidence whenever a producer doesn't have it, or whenever they're trying to maybe bolster up a claim that has information that could help. All of that being said, there are very few documents that are required for evidentiary purposes in this application. Documents may support the claim, they may be persuasive, and they may affect the amount a producer receives in financial assistance, if they really support the claim, but they are not required to be successful in this application. USDA has pretty repeatedly emphasized that they're not necessary. And part of this is because of that different evidentiary standard. And part of it's also because since there's no beginning date to the program, it's just really unlikely that a producer who experienced discrimination 40 or 50 years ago, or even 20 years ago, will have the kind of documentation that, would be needed for a higher standard. That being said, still, documents can be helpful. As you're helping producers through the application, we've found that just naming different types of documents that could be applied to a section, it can be helpful with jogging a producer's memory. You could think of things like property records, deeds, leases, land surveys, banking and financial records, loan documentation, farm loan history, tax documents showing revenue or profits. It could be, we were talking about Keep Seal earlier, the document or documents that could be submitted could be related to that. While every producer will input the discrimination they experience into this application, attaching a Keep Seal claim could be very persuasive. BIA leases, emails and letters with FSA staff and or banking institutions. Again, this is not exhaustive. It's just ways to help producers think about documents they may have that could be helpful. I'm ready for the next one. Thank you. So the actual application, the paper application is 40 pages long, and it is split up into 10 different parts. This has been one of our struggles with, in some instances, trying to convince producers to apply for this program. The page count is really, even today, several months into this, it's pretty overwhelming. You all, if you don't have a paper copy of the application, let me know and we can figure out a way to get one to you. But it's a lot of information. There's a lot of parts that producers have to read pretty carefully through to make sure they're not missing something. So continue on those parts. There's 10 different parts. So the application is split up into 10 different areas of information. And these parts are really repetitive, especially during the discrimination section where producers can explain their situation. The questions, there are 7 or 8 of them, and half of them sound like they're asking the same thing with 1 or 2 words changed. So because of that, because of how repetitive it is, we've been encouraging producers to be repetitive in their answers. Answer every question fully each time, even if you think you already answered it before. And because of all of these different parts, it's a whole lot easier to navigate the online version, which we'll get more into specifics on in the next few slides. But essentially, it just cuts out a lot of the information that doesn't have to be inputted. And it's also easier to navigate. The actual discrimination is going to be decided by a third party who's a non-governmental entity that's processing the applications and making the ultimate determinations. I said that earlier that this was a program that was brought under the Inflation Reduction Act. So Congress passed it, and part of the language in the bill was that this had to be facilitated by somebody, a third party who's not connected to the government. USDA's given different reasons for this, but essentially because of the really long history of discrimination, Congress, elected to put this with a party who doesn't have any kind of bias in the application results. And another point on that, we've gotten pretty much every event we filled a lot of questions about retaliation and whether or not there's a chance that if they apply for this program, the FSA office that they've had a lot of issues with will retaliate against them. USDA, again, has pretty explicitly said there will be no form of retaliation. It's on the first page of the application and the FAQ, and it's something that's talked about probably weekly in our meetings with USDA. I hesitate to ever give producers a solid answer because at the end of the day, we don't know how all of the information that's submitted will be used. We do know, or who all will have access to it, but we do know that the program really clearly outlines that there can't be any form of retaliation and that there are legal remedies for that if there are. So it's something to keep in mind because as you're helping producers apply for this, it's almost a guarantee that you will run into those kind of fears just based off of past instances of discrimination. I am good for the next one, Cameron. Thank you. So here is just a screenshot of what the paper application looks like. We will continue to talk through it, but I want to kind of highlight in section A on step 1, you see all of these blue boxes. That's part of what makes the paper application really complicated. There's a lot of information to read through, and there's also a lot of information that's pretty easily missed. For instance, you can see at the top of the left side of the page in the supporting documentation request box, there are must and may highlighted and underlined. That's where somebody must submit documentation and it's a strict requirement. So without documentation on a specific question that requires it, that question isn't going to be complete. There are a lot of places in the application where there are may submit documentations. This is a place where there isn't any requirement for somebody to provide evidence or provide documentation, but you can. I like to think of these as persuasive. So if you have a document that is relevant to one of the may categories, it could be helpful in proving your claim or showing that that the applicant was discriminated against. But kind of the takeaway from it is it's complicated and it's spread throughout the application, these must and mays. So it's pretty easy for a producer to miss something if they're not really reading super carefully. Another thing you'll notice is on the right-hand side, we have, again, a supporting documentation request box with all of these different check boxes. As we will talk in the next few slides on the online application, these check boxes are what make the online application much easier. But on the paper, you have to check the box and just make sure you're reading really carefully. And then the other thing, it's not on this page, but on most of the pages, you see how the supporting documentation request is kind of a box that's shaded a light gray. That panel will be on the right side of most pages of the application, again, in that same kind of light gray shaded color. Okay, I think we're good to go to the next. So continuing on this, what are some of the pros of the online application? All of those boxes, those both check boxes and empty fields that can be typed into, the online application will automatically block out any questions or sections that do not apply to the applicant. So similar to, if you just get back to that last page again, Cameron. Similar to these little check boxes on the online application, whenever somebody checks one, it automatically removes whatever fields did not need to be filled in, which takes the page count from 40 pages significantly down. You can go ahead and head to the next slide again. So it's automatically going to block out those sections of the application that applicant does not need to fill out. Additionally, the online system won't let applicants advance to the next step if they have not provided all the necessary information in the step that they're on. This ensures that they do not miss any required questions. So again, while in the paper application, it's really easy to miss stuff, and missing something could, be detrimental to an applicant. If you apply online, it's impossible to go to the next step without filling out all of the required information in the step that you're on. Additionally, the online application, after a producer submits the application, they may return to the dashboard and monitor the status of the application. Go ahead and switch to the next one. So, as you see in the bold highlight or the bold yellow box, applicants may see the status of their submitted applications here. So when an online account is created, you'll have the application that you're working on in this box that the yellow arrow is pointing to, and you will be able to see the status of it as it's being completed, and then also after the application is submitted. So just another area where the online applications got some more user-friendly pieces to it. As good as that is, it's also, equally frustrating because we don't have any kind of method to help producers who submit paper applications with knowing whether or not their application, where it's at in the process of being reviewed, whether there were any boxes that were missed. It's just, there's a lot more uncertainty with submitting the paper application that doing it online kind of removes for you. This is also like I said, this is the home page. So in a scenario where you're working with a producer who maybe already submitted an application before they knew that IAC or somebody working with IAC was helping, they could submit another application, and it would also be shown in this box here that the arrow is pointing at. So you could just make sure that you were working on the right one. Any questions so far? Nope. Okay, I think we're good. So what are some of the cons of the online application? First, producers must have email addresses and internet access to create the account and to fill out an application on the portal. This has been probably the biggest issue IAC has had in our outreach. It's no secret that there are a lot of broadband issues and a lack of connectivity throughout Indian country. So there's a chance that producers you're working with, especially elder producers, are either not going to have an email address or they won't have access to internet to fill out the application and continue working on it. We've been pretty vocal with USDA about this. I think in reply, they've said that paper applications are going to be graded just the same. There's not going to be any difference in that. That's partially because the applications that are submitted via paper will be typed up by one of the vendors who helps oversee the program and then submitted in the same online version. But that's just not a reality in a lot of the places that we're at and for a lot of the producers we're working with. So one of the big cons is that internet access is just a big issue and a barrier for some people in applying. You also must save the application as you go, or it's possible that progress, if you got an unstable internet connection, will be lost. Or if you were to exit the browser while you were working on the application and you didn't hit save first, there's the chance that you're also going to lose that information. Another piece, there's a word count on the narrative questions, which we'll be able to see in the next slide, but you can be more limited in your replies on the online application. There are ways to get around this with additional pages, but it's just kind of complicated. So that could be an issue for, let's say, a producer who's, got a narrative that's pretty substantial and covers a lot of words. And then the other issue is that all documents submitted, including the application itself, have to be in total under 100 megabytes. So if you have a lot of documents, if a producer has, extensive documentation of the discrimination, that could be a barrier as well. Again, there are workarounds for it. You can submit, even if you submit an online application, you could still submit your evidence or your documents via paper. But that also, there are downsides to that. There's a greater chance that there will be some issue in connecting them with your application. There's a chance that something could be lost. There's just issues that could come up if you try to do it separately. So it's for those who have a lot of documents, it's just good to keep in mind that they will have to, at the very least, get them condensed to under 100 megabytes for them to be able to upload to the online portal. Okay, I think we're good to go to the next one. So yeah, as you can see here, we can start off on the bottom left-hand side. We saw the front page of the online portal a few slides ago. This is the page that producers, or you as you're helping out producers, will see as they're working through the online application. So in the bottom left, we have here that the system will not let an applicant advance to the next step if they've not provided all of the necessary information in the previous step, ensuring that they do not miss any required questions. So as you can see along here, all of these boxes are completed and they've got shaded in green. We've got one box with an error. That probably means it was complete at some point, but there was some kind of issue. Maybe you changed one of the boxes that you originally selected. For whatever reason, there's something that changed that requires you to go back and review it. And then right underneath errors, still on that left side, is the orange shaded box that says incomplete. And these are the ones that you could save while you're working on them, but you won't actually be able to submit the application while you have incomplete boxes. The middle there, you see the save button, kind of like working in a Word document or a PDF. I hit save as often as possible, especially whenever you're out in the field working with somebody. If internet's at all spotty, hitting save could save a lot of heartache in the long run with somebody missing something in their application. Excuse me. And then on the right-hand side, you have that the online application will automatically block out any questions or sections of the application that do not apply to that applicant. So as I was saying before, there are certain boxes that you check as you go along. And on the online version, based off of those boxes, it automatically removes what the producer does not need to fill in. So on this page, if you look at this top under step 4, question 1, you could select all that apply. So you don't have to just select one option, but you select whatever applies to that producer. So they participated in direct lending or guaranteed lending, or they attempted to participate in one or the other. And based off of that selection, you will fill out certain portions of step 4 below. So as you can see there, fill out, if you selected the first box, fill out part A below. In this scenario, we've selected that third box. So it's for somebody who attempted to participate in direct lending. And because of that, we are filling out part C below, meaning parts A and B, you can't even input information into. Again, this is just how the application can pretty quickly go from 40 pages to quite a bit less, which is why when it's possible, the online application is pretty user-friendly. It makes the process seem a little bit less daunting, both for producers and individuals who are helping producers work through them. I think we can go to the next one. So again, if you look at that bright yellow box, all written questions are bound by a word count. So on the right of each one of the text boxes in the application, there will be a gray shaded box with the word count that can be included for that specific answer. I think just as kind of a point of practice, we haven't had a lot of issues with people not fitting into the word count. Off the top of my head, there are 2 or 3 applicants that we're either helped or in the process of helping who have kind of continually run into that word count issue. But for most people, that hasn't been an issue. In a scenario where it is, there's a portion later in the application where you can include additional information. It's not going to be on every one of these sections. Like you aren't able to, include additional information for a name that's longer than 100 characters. But for the more substantive portions of the application, so where producers are explaining the discrimination or showing their economic loss, there's the ability to add on additional pages whenever you hit the word count. I think we're good. So pros of the PDF paper application, you don't need the internet to complete it. It's about as simple as that. Outside of that, I think the online application is more user-friendly in every way. However, even if somebody is applying online, I would advise you to encourage that they fill out a paper application at the same time, if not beforehand, for a couple different reasons. One, even if you are submitting online, if something happens and the online portal does crash or there's an issue with it, you're not going to be starting over or having to start over a portion of the application because you already have, the main pieces of what you're including in the paper version. The other reason is that while there are doesn't seem that there's going to be any type of subsequent program like this using the same criteria. That was kind of thought to be the same whenever Keep Siegel happened. And now we've got a lot of producers who are still eligible for the program because they were Keep Siegel recipients or just because they applied for it. But because they didn't think they needed that documentation anymore, they threw it away. Technically, they don't need it. There's not any kind of requirement in this application that makes the original Keep Siegel information required. But like I've said, it's been really helpful. So if there's anything in the future where a producer wants to reflect back on this application or pull information from it, having both a paper version that they can keep and an online version that they submit is pretty helpful. I think we can go to the next. So cons of the paper application, like I've mentioned a few times, there's a possibility of missing or completing sections that do or do not apply to the applicant. So you could, accidentally fill out something on one of the pages that doesn't actually apply to you, or you could more easily get confused on the portions that you are filling out since it doesn't automatically remove sections for you. You also must submit the application by either dropping it off at a regional office or by dropping it off at a local office or mailing it to a regional office, which we'll cover more in depth in a few slides. But essentially, submitting the application, you're dealing with not only a lot of times the Postal Service, but you're also dealing with human errors because somebody is going to take the paper application and type your answers into the online portal. So there's just more chances for errors. And then the third thing, you must find a printer or a copier for the application if you do it online and for the supporting documentation. This could end up being pretty costly. And also it just adds more steps to the process. So if somebody's able to apply online, that's what we're going to suggest each time, both for whoever's helping them and for their sake, but also for the applicant's sake, just because there's not as many steps that they're going to have to do to make sure their application gets to the right place. Yep. Okay. Thank you. So any questions? We're about to get into the more substantive portion where I'll kind of walk through how we guide producers into telling their story to us and then getting it onto the application. So before that, any questions, any things you'd like me to revisit or that didn't make sense? Nope. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that, IACs, our role hasn't changed, but how we're addressing or how we're using our resources has to some degree. And part of that comes with this kind of narrative setup that we've come up with. This is basically a tool both to help us and the producers tell their story. So not only, get information about the discrimination that happened, but how can we paint or help them paint a full picture of their operation, of the discrimination, and of the effect that it's had on them. So I said earlier that the application split up into 10 steps, but that's really not only somewhat overwhelming, but also a little bit unnecessary. We found that it's kind of more divided into 3 sections. And it's a section that focuses more on a producer's background or a would-be producer's background and kind of their personal story. There's a portion of the application that focuses on the actual discrimination. So from inception to today, how the discrimination came about, the effect that it's had on their operation, the effect that it's had on their, mental well-being, basically just what the discrimination was and how it kind of played out. And then the third portion is more so about the economic loss. So with this framework, we found that getting the narrative together, this gets the narrative together pretty well. And then it's a little bit easier for IAC to go back and look at that narrative information and based off of that, input what's needed in the application. I like to think to some degree, we're all thinking of ourselves as writers on whenever we're helping somebody with an application, because first and foremost, we're helping them with that narrative. So I would say to the degree you feel comfortable or are able to, whenever you're sitting with them, take down all the information that you can. And then whenever you go back, which we'll kind of walk through, you can refine that information so that, you could essentially go through the application and have everything you need to finish it out or to help them finish it out. So what are those 3 sections? The first one is a section about you. Here, we want to focus on the producer's background, how they got into farming or ranching, what their farming or ranching operations looked like. You could think of acres of land, equipment, livestock, different types of livestock that they may have. But it's also just all three of these points are ways to kind of try and jog a producer's memory about their story. So in this, you might also ask, whether or not a producer did they have experience in farming or ranching prior to starting their operation? Did they own or lease land before they started operating? How many acres was that? If they weren't able to farm because of the discrimination, you might describe what their plans for the farm were. So, for instance, if somebody was denied even the ability to apply for a loan, and because of that, never ended up, starting an operation or purchasing cattle or buffalo or whatever it was. So essentially, if they weren't able to farm because they were discriminated against, you could explain what that farm would have looked like, how it would look today. So basically, it's just more context for whoever's reading this application to give them an idea of where this person comes from, any relevant ties to agriculture they may have, and also it helps set up the type of discrimination that you'll talk about in the next few sections. So if we look at the second point about the discrimination you experienced, so helping producers describe and walk through that discrimination, things to think about on this, relevant dates. When did the discrimination occur? A lot of times, again, because we are dealing with instances of discrimination that happened sometimes decades ago, the exact month and year might not be readily available to that producer. In that scenario, I not only try and, encourage them that kind of specific information is not going to be a determining factor, but also at the same time, try and offer different solutions. So, was there if you remember the year, do you remember what season it was? I was trying to get an operating loan for the fall of '87. So I went in to speak with FSA in the spring. You don't have to say I went in on April 19th, but just something that, again, tries to place whoever's reading your application in your shoes so that they can see the entire experience. This section, you would also want to think about information about the FSA office and staff you dealt with or the producer dealt with. So this is a great place to think of names. I mentioned earlier that one thing we've seen is that a lot of counties have, a really high concentration of discrimination. So naming somebody who you experienced that with or who the producer experienced discrimination with is super helpful. Part of our goal in specifically, trying to encourage producers to call out the names of FSA workers who they were discriminated by or were discriminated against from. Part of that motivation is that we want USDA, whenever they finally receive all of this information after the discrimination has been decided, we want them to see that there are huge issues in parts of the country. And a lot of times those issues are coming from one or two or three people. So information specifically about the office is super helpful, and a lot of times it's really relevant. And then also just generally, you're talking about, or you're helping the producer talk about how the discrimination impacted them. What was the emotional toll? What was the fallout from their farm? How did it affect their family? So trying to think of it, again, not just as what happened on paper, but their entire narrative. How did this discrimination affect their life? Some additional things that you could think of for this section. It's really helpful to prepare a timeline of events that occurred first to last. We started off whenever we first started training people doing just straight chronological order for putting a story together. That can be helpful, but it also can be a little bit overwhelming because we've seen that producers, when they feel like they're starting to miss things or can't remember exactly how it happened, frustration kind of comes in. So you could think of it as a way to kind of loosely organize their thoughts. I know the discrimination started happening in 87. I know around 95, could have been 93 or 4, but I think it was 95. I went into the office and X happened. A few months later, I went into the office again and X happened. So it's helpful, but not necessary that they be specific dates. So yeah, that's the timeline. Another way to think about this is you could explain why you think the actions described were discriminatory. This is basically trying to describe how USDA treated one applicant different than the other. So, I think I said earlier that the definition for discrimination is pretty broad under the program, and that's essentially it. How were you treated? How was the producer treated differently than others by that same office, by that same person? By, how was this group of Indians treated differently than this group of white people who were in the same county working with the same FSA loan officer? So an example of this, a producer went into their FSA office to receive a loan application, but the loan officer told them that they were no longer giving out applications. However, that producer knew that they gave a loan application to a different person around the same time. That's a, low-level example. It's a simplified example, but in that you can see that, dates can be helpful. They can show where you are in relation to somebody else, but you didn't need the exact date on that to describe that individual in that scenario was treated differently than somebody else trying to access the same goods. Additionally, you could, I'm sorry, that's the next one. So that's a good stopping point for the discrimination piece. We next go to the piece about economic loss. So helping a producer describe their economic loss and, importantly, show the math of how they got that number. Examples of this, higher interest rates if you had to get a loan from a traditional bank. So you weren't able to secure an FSA loan that was at a more favorable interest rate. Therefore, you had to go to the bank with a higher interest rate and maybe even, a different pay period that makes it harder for that producer to successfully pay off or keep up with their payments. Showing your math could include showing how livestock prices changed because of some kind of discrimination. Were you required to sell your livestock at an unfavorable time? Did you have a instance where you were denied an operating loan? So to keep good with all of your payments, you had to take half your calf crop to the sale 3 months before you were taking the rest of them, and you ended up taking a big loss on that. Other examples of economic loss, missed revenues based on the length of time it took to receive approval for an FSA loan. You could also think of it as things you lost, potentially land that you lost because of the discrimination, what the value of that land was. Did you have to go elsewhere to acquire that loan? Kind of like I said, with higher interest rates. If you weren't able to start a farm or ranch because of the discrimination, is it likely that your operation would have been profitable? This is a scenario that we've seen a lot working with producers, especially in Indian country. People who 20 years ago applied to start or take over a farm or ranch, and because they were denied, they never tried again. Trying to get that producer to give details about what their plan was at the time, how they plan to grow their operation, all of that can be really beneficial, because you can then take that and try and calculate where they might be at today if they, wouldn't have ever been discriminated against. For an example, somebody who was denied a $60,000 loan to buy 20 years ago, 65 head of cattle. But because they were denied the loan, they didn't get the cattle, and they never applied for another one, or they were applied for others, but still couldn't get somebody to give them a loan. You could take what their original plan was. So he wanted to buy 60 head of cattle, and you could calculate over the 20 years what that herd might look like today, both in number of head. So reasonably, how might that herd have grown? You could then calculate, today, if you still had, or if you were able to grow that herd, what would the value of that herd in its entirety be today? And that economic difference between the number you got and the original 60,000, that could be an example of showing the economic loss. I think another point on economic loss that USDA's made, in addition to showing your math, it's that this is a place, again, where producers can get creative. There's not one way to show that somebody had faced some type of economic loss because of discrimination. So even in those scenarios, like I just said, where somebody was never able to start farming or ranching reasonably, so, if you were in their shoes, trying to parse out what that operation would look like today, even if it's not exact, but doing it and showing how you got that number can be enough for them to use in the actual determining factor for amounts that will be received through the discrimination payments. I think I've actually already said it, but just to drive it home, especially in instances where somebody lost land or a house, it's really important to get as close to an exact, or as close to a reasonable estimate of that loss as possible, because that's something that USDA can actually look at and say, this is, while we might have to add things up or think creatively about other scenarios, land loss because of discrimination is a little bit more clear cut. So if you have a producer that has lost something like that, a piece of real property, going into detail on that can be really helpful. At least that's what we've heard in different conversations with USDA. I think we're good to go to the next one. So I guess actually, are there any questions on that previous telling your story piece? I know that's where a lot of questions we get kind of on and off from IEC employees is, how do the tell your story part's the difficult part. So are there any kind of questions on that, or ideas about advice for how you might help producers?
Hi, this is Crystal Kelly from the Shoshone-Paiute tribes in Hawaii. And
Hey, Crystal.
I'm now in the Natural Resource Land Department for the tribes. And so part of our deal is helping them with their grazing and cattle situations. There is actually probably a good 10 people that are interested in this DFAP, but a lot of them were like youth loan applicants, and they had received funds, but due to, calling the FSA office, asking for records regarding their promissory notes and any file follow-up. And the FSA office, recently stating, hey, we don't have anything in file regarding your name at all. Them pretty much feeling like they got scratched off the list. I mean, that's how they're kind of feeling they were discriminated. But when it comes to that, and knowing that the November 3rd deadline is passed, how would they proceed if they don't have a lot of their on-hand documentation due to maybe, parents at the time taking care of the paperwork, things happening with moves, they don't have the paperwork anymore, they have some here and there, but not all. How would they proceed with getting that evidence and that backup documentation? Would it be a statement or, yeah, how?
Yeah, totally. It's a great question. So first thing that pops to my mind is the statement under penalty of perjury. Any scenario where somebody doesn't have documents but would really like to include evidence that is persuasive or supportive of what they're saying, that statement can be super helpful. It sounds like you might have a number of people who were in that same scenario. So kind of like I talked about earlier, the one stipulation for the statement is that it can't be a relative. So as long as those individuals, if you do have a big group of them, aren't connected, I would probably encourage you to help them write those statements in support of each other, especially, like I said earlier, if they are coming from the same office or dealing with the same FSA worker or USDA worker, whoever it is. They might not have known about the situation when it occurred, but they can explain their situation, that they, were a participant in the youth loan program, that they've attempted to receive or attempted to get documents from that program. And to do so, they called the FSA office and they were told X. On one hand, I'm a little confused how there'd be no record of them participating.
There was actually a family of 5. Each
Mhm.
child at the time they were in high school, they had a youth loan. Call the FSA office. The FSA office is saying, we don't have any files with your name on it. Being that was 16, 17 years ago, I understand the 7-year ratio, but for them to not have any documents stating that they dealt with these children at the time, or teenagers, that kind of throws me off a little bit. They are tribal, 100 miles from the closest FFSA office. And with that being said, there's not there, and even right now we're having a lot of problems with the FSA office even helping, due to the fact that they have so much turnover, but due to the fact that they don't really feel like they are needing to provide heavy services in our area. And so I'm like, man, it would be awesome if they could just do it now. We're having so many issues with them.
So it does sound like it's potential that there's an instance of discrimination with just in the dealing with them currently. I would say it's one thing to keep in mind is there is the January 1st, 2021 deadline. So if the entire instance of discrimination was based off of how they've received treatment while they're trying to apply for this program, so essentially if it all happened in the last few months, I think you'd be in tricky water on saying that that is where the discrimination began.
Well, they felt the discrimination was at the time due to the fact that they had no follow-up. They got the loan given to them. There was no follow-up. They were just required to pay money and would get a letter once in a while saying, you owe this much, you need to sell this many cows. Which, yeah, that selling this many cows with that number is fine, but requiring them to sell the majority of their stock to make up for their loan was where they felt like we have no future in it. And it caused most of them to quit because they didn't have any follow-up to continue their ranching career.
So in that scenario, I would say I agree with you. The discrimination began whenever the loan servicing didn't happen, or potentially even whenever they were applying for it based off of how they were treated. So I was saying it can't be discrimination, the instance can't be after January 1st, 2021. However, in instances like this, so there, you've said the discrimination happened, let's say 15 years ago. Even though we're past the 2021 deadline, the discrimination is continued under that because they're now facing or they're now dealing with an FSA department that is continuing the discrimination. So while it's after the deadline period, you want to explain the discrimination as it's happening all the way up to the present day. So even though, in an application or in a statement under penalty of perjury, I would explain the discrimination that originally happened. And then I would also include that even though it's past the deadline, that discrimination that began 15 years ago is present today, and it's been present throughout them trying to submit a DFAP application. So I think as far as evidence goes, again, I would try and find individuals who could help each other or just anybody they know who is aware of the discrimination. So like if their parents told cousins at the time that, oh my gosh, we just got our kids signed up for it 6 months ago, and now we can't even get them to return our calls. There could be instances like that where somebody could provide, a basis for what they're saying from the time, but also as this is continued, if there are more individuals who are aware of it today or have been aware of it, in recent history, they could also submit one that just helps to explain that discrimination has been ongoing since the original instance. The other thing is throughout the application, specifically in step 5, where you describe the brunt of the discrimination, this is where it's important to remember that evidence documentation is not required. I would explain everything that you just said to me and more in kind of that narrative structure, and then you'll be able to put that information into the boxes that describe the discrimination. So even if you only have documents such as statements under penalty of perjury, you're still able to tell their entire narrative and, explain that they might have documentation today if the discrimination wasn't ongoing. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that actually makes sense a lot. So I've
Okay.
been taking notes this whole time because I have pretty good handful that's getting really interested in this. So
Definitely. And that's tell your friends too. I think the statement, helping each other out in a statement can be great, especially if you have somebody like you who knows all the individuals or who's working with all of the individuals that it happened to out of that same office. You can get specific in what all is said to really support what you want to get across.
okay, thank you.
Of course. That is a great question though, because we see the first point on this page is records request deadline, which was November 3rd, 2023. So we're past it. However, just because the deadline to submit requests is passed does not mean that requests submitted after won't be fulfilled. There's a possibility that USDA could get to requests that were submitted after the after the records request deadline, but there's just no guarantee. Right now, if you submitted a request by the deadline, USDA is committed to getting you documents, if there are any, prior to the January 13th application deadline. But if you submit them now, there's still a possibility that you could receive them. It's just USDA is not making any guarantees. And I think in full transparency, I was on a meeting with them today, earlier today, and the total number of record request submissions that they received the night of November 3rd was between 4,500 and 5,000 people, I believe. So I think it's probably unlikely that they're going to get to any more requests submitted now, but it's worth a chance if you think there might be records out there that could be helpful. Just at the end of the day, you don't have to have them to be successful in this. In addition to that, the application submission deadline is January 13th, 2024. Electronic applications must be submitted by 11:59 p.m. Eastern time. Hard copy applications, whether they're delivered in person or mailed, I want to say must be submitted by January 13th at 8 p.m. So essentially in the mail portion, enough time for them to be postmarked. And applications, if you miss the deadline, there is no appeal period. So if you're working on the application or helping producers up to the deadline, it's just important to remember that there are options for submitting. So even if you're pushing it close, you might have alternatives that you could do to make sure it gets in time. But it's just important to remember that there's a little bit shorter deadline for the paper applications. And then finally, DFAP applications are available. Oh, actually, I'm going to back up. Submitting an application. If you are submitting an application, specifically, how do you do it? So like we said earlier, you can do it online via the online portal, which is available at that hyperlink at the bottom of the page. You can mail a paper copy to the applicant's regional office, or you can in person drop off a copy at the applicant's local office. So there are both regional and local offices. There are 4 regions that cover the US. And depending on what state the person is, depends on what regional office they have. And you can drop off the in-person applications at one of the state offices. There's a state office in all 50 states except for Massachusetts, which is working on one right now. And in a second, we will go to the page where you can see where those regional and local offices are. Cameron, are you able to see the speaker notes on this application?
No, I'm not.
Do you mind putting that 2207apply.gov into your browser and pulling it up? Or yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, that was just the email. 2207apply.gov. Thank you. Okay, could you go to the How Do I Apply tab at the top of the page? Right there. And if you scroll down, you see first of all that there's that online, mail, or in-person difference for how you can submit an application. And if you keep scrolling down a little bit further, you will get a little bit further, I think. Okay, so here are the regional offices. This is where complete applications can be mailed. So we've got 4 different regions, and it's listed, each of the states that's in the region is listed right there, as well as the address for submitting the application. If you go down a little bit further, you have the local offices, and these are in-person offices in each state. If you keep scrolling down, yep, there's that list. Oh, I lied. Scroll back up a little bit. In-person local office list.
Right here.
Yes. So here, this takes you to the office location for each state. So this is where applications, if somebody is submitting a paper application in person, they can go to their local office listed here. I think a couple points on that though, and you can go back to the PowerPoint whenever you're ready. Thank you. A couple points on that. I would definitely call if you're working with a producer who would like to submit their application in person, if it's within a reasonable driving distance for them. I'd definitely call beforehand to make sure that it's going to be staffed. USDA has been working with the vendors on ensuring that the offices are staffed, but honestly, it's been pretty rough service so far. There have been instances where just nobody shows up at the local offices, and there have been other times where there've been not altercations, but just people not acting like they should be. So I would make sure and call beforehand and make sure it's staffed, and that somebody that sounds somewhat like they know what they're doing is there. But if you don't want to do that, but they'd still like to submit a paper application, they can be mailed to that regional office that we looked at. I think you can close out of the presentation. Okay. I know that was a lot of information and not a ton of time. Are there any questions that you have? New Mexico is not on the list. Are they not receiving in-person applications? They should be. Let me make a note. So I'll send an email about that. I would say for New Mexico, you are in region 4. Is that right? Yeah. So it doesn't look like there's any option right now. I think that might be an error because earlier today there was just that one office that was left. So Desva, let me check with Margot at USDA and get back to you on New Mexico. I'll try and have an answer for that before our training tomorrow.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Of course. Are there any other questions or comments? Cameron, is there anything else that you can think of that we didn't cover that was discussed in the notes?
I don't think so, but I shared the form in the chat. If anyone was interested in becoming a DFAP outreach collaborator.
Perfect. And do you? Yeah, okay. Are there any questions about that from anyone who's interested in being a DFAP collaborator? No. Okay, I'm going to put my contact information in the chat box. Please feel free if you've got questions about anything, or if you've got, a scenario that you've come across that you want feedback on, don't hesitate to send me an email or give me a call. I'm somewhat behind on email right now. because we're doing quite a bit of travel for DFAP and are working with quite a few producers. So give me a little bit of time if I don't immediately respond, but don't hesitate to follow up again. If there aren't anything else, I think we're good to go. Thank you, everybody.